think it's time for us to start. Hello and welcome. The last 2 days have been just amazing, and I'm so happy to have everyone here with us. I am Devonna Bell, NCAT's Director of Sustainable Agriculture, Food Systems, and Rural Communities. I have the great privilege to work with our agricultural specialists from all over the country, many of whom you've seen today and yesterday in the fantastic talks. I have worked in sustainable regenerative agriculture for over 20 years, all over the nation and globe. I learned so much from the communities all around the world about traditional food and farming and how it is directly related to our health. The CDC says that in the United States, 19% of young people aged 2 to 19 years and 40% of adults have obesity. This can put them at risk for heart disease, type 2 diabetes, some cancers, and in addition, obesity costs the US healthcare system $147 billion a year. Americans and many other Western countries suffer from an epidemic of food-related diseases. As we mentioned, obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular, liver and kidney diseases, and cancer and Alzheimer's disease. The US government estimates that about half of all American adults have one or more preventable chronic diseases, many of which are related to poor eating patterns and physical inactivity. And sadly, rates of these chronic diet-related diseases continue to rise. There's a growing body of evidence linking soil health to more nutrient-dense foods, a healthy soil ecosystem to human microbiome health, and thereby soil health's influence on human health. Livestock on pasture, eating a diversity of nutrient-dense plants, yields more nutrient-dense animal products. Farmers practicing regenerative agriculture are benefiting human and planetary health. So, with all of that, I am so excited to have Dr. Selena Ahmed with us today to talk about the linkages between soil health, human health, and planetary health. Dr. Ahmed is an associate professor of sustainable food systems at Montana State University, where she co-leads the Food and Health Lab and the Translational Biomarkers Core of the Center for American Indian and Rural Health Equity. Her federally funded research programs focus on 3 priority areas: sustainable agriculture, biodiversity, and global change, food environments, sustainable diets, and biomarkers of health, and inclusive food systems education. She is a prolific author of over 65 articles and co-author of 2 books. She has extensive academic training, including chemical ecology and clinical nutrition, doing her NIH postdoctoral research at Tufts University, biology and plant sciences in her PhD at the City University of New York and the New York Botanical Garden, cultural anthropology and ethnobotany from her Master's of Science from the University of Kent at Canterbury, and economics with her BA from Barnard College at Columbia University. We are so incredibly fortunate to have Dr. Ahmed with us today. Before turning it over to her, I'll just go over a few really quick housekeeping items. This session is being recorded for later viewing. We will only be using the chat function in the Zoom meeting to accept questions. Please post your questions in the Zoom chat box, and I will relay them to the speaker during our Q&A time at the end of this session. And for those of you wishing to receive continuing education credits from the Certified Crop Advisors Organization, we will be displaying a QR code at the end of the presentation, which you can scan using your CCA app. And now I'm so happy to turn it over to Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you everybody for joining this presentation today, where I'll be presenting some data and some of the linkages between soil health and human well-being. And a lot of my thinking about the linkages between soil health and human health comes from my research, my long-term research since 2006, working in indigenous communities in southwestern China, where the Aka communities that I work with manage tea in these agroforest. And I have been very lucky and privileged to learn many sustainability lessons working with these communities, including really thinking about the linkages between soil health and human health. And so while my research very much was focusing on looking at tea quality, what I've been led to is really taking a more systems perspective and thinking about how if we want to manage human health, it's really critical that this starts from the soil. And so I call these lessons from stewards of tea agroforest the gifts of the guardians that very much have shaped my research program here at Montana State University. And I wanted to share a little bit about some of the preliminary work that we've done looking at linkages between the way we manage crops and their quality, and ultimately what that may mean for human health. And so just to start off with, I wanted to share some of the voices of these indigenous farmers that really highlights the understanding of the linkage of soil health to human health. And so this is from one Aka smallholder farmer in southwestern China. We pay attention to the way the soil is and what it needs. If we see crops looking unhealthy, we know something is wrong in the environment, and we start with the soil. We take care of it, the soil, so it can take care of the crops that then take care of us. Our Aka ways for diets need many types of plants and foods. These foods provide the body with vital energies needed for health. And while this indigenous framework for linking soil health to human health goes back many centuries, it is increasingly being recognized in public health. And so back in 2015, the concept of planetary health was leveraged and very much elevated to thinking about how the health of human civilizations very much depends on the state of natural systems. And the concept of planetary health has really since been promoted since 2015. So very much providing a framework for thinking about how the health of our environment and humans is connected. And then this is also being implemented by different governments and policies around the world, sort of looking at the connections between healthy people, healthy environments, and healthy animals. So the CDC has started to also promote the concept of One Health, looking at these connections between people's health and environmental or planetary health. And in this, they very much recognize the importance of giving power and empowering people who protect human health, animal health, and environmental health, and the need to collaborate with those people to coordinate and communicate really towards achieving planetary health. And as part of these partners, I would very much emphasize that farmers who manage our agro-ecosystems and our food supply very much have tremendous agency in supporting One Health. And this is increasingly being recognized in public health. And so just highlighting the agency that farmers have for planetary health, farmers have agency in managing the soil, which is the world's most biodiverse ecosystem, as we've been hearing about. And farmers also have agency in managing soil and crops that are the foundation, ultimate foundation for food security. And it's also all stakeholders really in the entire food system have agency in supporting planetary health and human health. And so consumers have agency in selecting foods grown from agricultural systems that promote healthy soils, and also selecting specific foods that support food security, not only for themselves and their households, but very much support food security for all, including future generations. And so I just wanted to present some of the background information so we're all on the same page regarding some of the challenges we're facing globally in terms of planetary health, soil health, and human health. And then I will share some of the linkages between these various types of health. And so for planetary health, these planetary boundaries have been proposed, and these are different Earth processes, 8 different processes, and if they're crossed, there would be unacceptable environmental change, and society and the environment would be at risk. And so if we're looking at these different planetary boundaries, it's the intersection really of the green and the yellow that we enter a zone of uncertainty or risk. And when we're looking at these different planetary boundaries in terms of genetic diversity, climate change, biogeochemical flows of nitrogen and phosphorus, land use change, we can begin to see the areas that we are in high risk, increasing risk. And so the red areas for genetic diversity, we're an area of high risk. And so when we're thinking about healthy soils and healthy humans and thinking about the soil microbiome and the genetic diversity, it presents, it's very much a solution for reversing and supporting planetary health. And likewise, in thinking about these biogeochemical flows of phosphorus and nitrogen, which were also in areas of high uncertainty, by managing soils in healthy ways, we can also reverse these environmental threats, and farming can very much be a solution. And so the dots that overlay on these planetary boundaries are really the role of agriculture in these areas of risk. And so we can see for genetic diversity, phosphorus and nitrogen, agriculture really has a huge role to play in this challenge, but also in the solution. And so there's, as we all know, there's many, many different types of agriculture, and the way we farm very much impacts planetary health. And so if we're comparing, for example, industrial agriculture to regenerative agriculture, that is really focused on nurturing the soils, very, very different impacts. And in this regard, farming can very much be a solution for supporting planetary health. And so just some background on the importance of soil health for humanity in providing tremendous amounts of ecosystem services, including food security, fiber, raw materials, carbon storage, helping with greenhouse gas regulation, flood mitigation, a range of cultural services, and I already said carbon storage. And so while soils present a great amount of ecosystem services, as we've been hearing today and yesterday, there's also these tremendous unprecedented pressures to soil health. And a lot of these pressures to soil health are linked directly to the pressures that we're facing for humanity and specifically for food security. So soil, being a very finite resource, is challenged with a rapid human population growth and the need for increased food consumption. And this is resulting in agricultural intensification in order to increase crop yield per unit of soil, and ultimately resulting in the unsustainable degradation of soils. And so the unsustainable degradation of soils, what does this mean? How is this characterized? This includes the loss of soil organic matter, release of greenhouse gases, the over-application of fertilizers, erosion, contamination with heavy metals and pathogens, acidification and salinization, and loss of genetic diversity. And then the outcomes of these unhealthy soils have tremendous implications for all of society and the long-term ability of soils to provide ecosystem services. There's economic loss that results through the loss of ecological services. There's health consequences that emerge because of the loss of food supply and food security. There's environmental consequences that ultimately impact human health. And then there's intergenerational inequity issues, not just thinking about our needs for soil, but really the needs for future generations. And so now I'm going to transition from that background to thinking about human health. And so one of the big connections between soil health and human health very much is through the food system and the foods we're eating grown directly in soils. And so when we're thinking about food systems, it's important to emphasize what is the key goal of food systems, and this is to provide food security. While there's various definitions of food security, the common components of a food security definition include providing sufficient amounts of food, adequate nutrient content in food, safe food, as well as desirable and delicious food to meet cultural preferences and lifestyles. And so thinking about food security and this goal of food systems, what does this look like around the world? Around the world, we are seeing that poor diets are a leading risk factor of the global burden of disease. Every country in the world is affected by malnutrition, including underweight and micronutrient deficiencies, as well as overweight. There's increased obesity, as we just mentioned, and this has been increasing over the past few decades. And while we are overall eating more food, what we're eating does not meet our dietary guidelines. And specifically, there is reduced intake below dietary recommendations, specifically for those foods that support nutrition, including fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. And these poor diets are supported by trends in global food production. There's increased availability throughout the world for cereals, meats, milk, and other animal products. There's also increased availability in things that are good for us, fruits and vegetables, as well as those that are used increasingly in ultra-processed foods, including vegetable oils. And there's also a tremendous rise in the production of ultra-processed foods. And all of these gains in food production have prices for ecological as well as human health, with degradation of ecosystems occurring at unprecedented rates. And at the same time, while we're producing more, our dietary quality is being reduced. A lot of this is also attributed to the fact that we are eating more and more away from home with lower dietary quality. And there is an increase in additives in these convenient foods that we're eating away from home, as well as contaminants in food packaging. And this is linked to lower dietary quality, as well as tremendous food safety issues with tremendous amounts of chemicals in these packagings that's associated with human and environmental hazards. And overall, this lower dietary quality has many implications for chronic disease, including cardiovascular disease and multiple forms of cancer. Also, human health concerns are linked to the increased use of pesticides. That's linked to the increased intensification that's happening in agricultural systems. And at the same time, much of what is produced is wasted. There's estimates that 1/3 to 1/4 of all food that's produced for human consumption gets lost throughout agri-food supply chains. And then at the same time, global change is exacerbating these food system challenges. And so while the food system has tremendous amounts of challenges, as I mentioned before, farming can really be a solution for supporting human and planetary health. And now I'm going to transition in some ways to show some evidence about these linkages. And first, I will start with the linkages of soil health to human health. So over the last few decades, there's been an emerging body of evidence that has actually focused on the negative linkages of soil health and human health. And more recently, the positive linkages of soil health and human health are being addressed. And that's a very exciting area of research. So I'll start with the negative first. The negative linkages between soil health and human health are that unhealthy soils need higher inputs that can lead to heavy metal consumption in humans, and also can lead to increased amounts of pathogens. And so this is very much linked with soil biodiversity. Research is showing that soils that have increased levels of biodiversity need lower inputs and can provide more ecosystem services, while soils that have lower amounts of soil biodiversity need increased amounts of agrochemical inputs. And this has direct implications for human health, for humans consuming those crops that can have chemical residues. So that's the negative. And then on the positive, which I'd like to focus on, and really how agriculture can be a champion of these positive linkages, soils provide many of the nutrients that crops require and that we require for supporting human health. Soils with high biodiversity also suppress disease-causing microorganisms that then can help regulate clean water and air. And this is very similar to having high diversity of microbiome in our own guts. A high diversity in our microbiome also suppresses many disease-causing agents. And there's also evidence and historical usage of soils as a search for antibiotics in medicines. And so the exposure for soils for humans can be direct, with farmers interacting directly through the soil, or it can be indirect. And today I'll mostly focus on the indirect exposure of soils for humans and the benefits it provides for food security. And so directly, farmers can interact with the soil through ingestion, respiration, and skin absorption. And indirectly, we can interact with the soil through the foods we consume. And this really is where crop quality and food security come into play. So I'll be focusing on the indirect linkages first, on the way soil health influences human health. And so again, this is really through that connection of the food system in linking soil health and human health. And specifically, this is thinking about crop quality, the crops grown in soils that we ultimately consume. And by managing high quality soils that have high microbial diversity, there's lots of evidence that's emerging that this results in higher crop quality. Crop quality is a multi-dimensional parameter, which includes vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals, also known as secondary metabolites. These are those compounds that plants have that result in the health attributes that we value as consumers, as well as those compounds that taste delicious, those organoleptic or sensory compounds, the flavor compounds, the aroma compounds. And so managing soils for high crop quality ultimately can lead to health benefits for humans. And so one big connection between soil fertility and human health is thinking about crop nutrient quality. Soils are the source for 14 to 18 different essential nutrients for crop health. And human health is also dependent on these essential nutrients from our foods, either directly or indirectly through animal products. And so soil very much is the foundation for our human nutrition through the crop nutrition that we are consuming. And globally, there are micronutrient deficiencies that humans are experiencing. And if we begin to manage soils for these micronutrient deficiencies, that then crops can upregulate and then humans can consume, this is very much a solution in thinking about how we can address these micronutrient deficiencies around the world, including here in the United States. Key micronutrient deficiencies are iron deficiency that causes anemia, dizziness and fatigue, selenium deficiency that impacts cardiovascular health, as well as mental health, including contributing to depression and anxiety, and then zinc deficiency, which is linked to the immune system as well as the gastrointestinal tract. And so now I'm going to transition into thinking about the evidence regarding the impacts of managing soil for human health, specifically through crop quality. And this is some preliminary evidence coming out of our lab, the Food and Health Lab, led by students looking at different ways that the soil is managed and how that impacts crop quality. And so this was looking at soil and weed management practice, looking at a control, specifically a clover cover cropping regime and black plastic mulch on tomatoes. And the evidence found that the clover treatments had overall higher soil quality based on these nutrient levels of phosphorus and potassium. And then when we analyzed the crops in the lab, we found that the clover treatment also resulted in tomatoes that had higher total phenolic concentration, which is a proxy measure for the antioxidant compounds that have antioxidant properties in humans that consume those crops that ultimately can have anti-inflammatory properties to mitigate diet-related chronic disease. And so here we're showing how different ways of managing soils and weeds impact soil quality, but also the crops that we're consuming from those fields. And here's some additional evidence looking at conventional systems compared to organic graze systems and organic tilled systems, specifically for lentils here in Montana. And we also found that the organic graze and organic till systems had higher levels of potassium as well as sulfur compared to the conventional system, whereas the till system had lower amounts of crude protein compared to the conventional and organic grazed system. And here's some data looking at a whole bunch of secondary metabolites linked to the flavor attributes and health properties of wheat. And I won't go into the details of this, but here we can see that the way that the wheat is managed differentially impacts these compounds that are linked to the flavor and health attributes of the crops. And then this is for my long-term research in Yunnan province of China, looking at tea agroforests. I've also looked at conventional and organic systems that are specifically managed for soil quality and found that the diversified agroforest as well as organic systems have higher amounts of catechin compounds. And these are the compounds, again, linked to the flavor and health attributes of tea sourced from these systems. And so in addition to the direct health effects that we have as consumers, there's lots of implications for sustainability. And if we're consuming these crops, for example, tomatoes, based on the nutrients it's providing, we are actually getting a lot more nutrients if we're managing soils in a specific way that may give us double or 1.5 times the amount of these nutrients and secondary metabolites or health compounds. And so this has tremendous amounts of sustainability implications, as we don't need to rely on necessarily increasing yield and increasing agrochemical input, but we can really focus on managing crops for healthy soils to have these healthy compounds. And so this has tremendous implications really for sustainability in thinking about agricultural intensification versus really managing for nutrient density per unit of food. And so food quality is also very central to consumer decision making and can help farmers in terms of their livelihoods. There's some graphs missing here, but in our lab, we've shown that phytochemical quality is very much linked to sensory preferences at the marketplace. Here we go. And we found that higher quality very much in terms of the phytochemicals is also recognized by consumers in the way they're tasting those foods. And this results in higher price premiums that the farmers are receiving. And so we have lots of evidence to show that consumers are willing to pay price premiums for specific attributes based on flavor. And then overall, beyond the research that we've done in our lab, taking a systematic literature review into account, we see that agricultural management, specifically organic versus conventional agriculture, impacts crop quality. A systematic review based on 343 different publications showed that organic crops and foods had statistically higher concentrations of these antioxidant compounds that are linked to reducing diet-related chronic disease. And then also foods that taste better may actually increase their chance of consumption. And so it's not just about consumers recognizing the health benefits of those foods. If they're just delicious because they are more nutrient dense, that's related to these different flavor compounds, they actually may have a higher chance of consuming these foods. And so now shifting from the linkage of soil health to human health based on crop quality, I wanted to touch upon sort of the direct linkages that people ask about. Is increased soil diversity, is it directly related to increased diversity of the human gut microbiome? And so for thinking about the benefits of soil diversity, there's lots of evidence that shows that soil microbial diversity supports with nutrient cycling and nutrient bioavailability for crops. And there's also a lot of evidence that shows that increased diversity of the human gut microbiome impacts human health, including cardiovascular disease and suppressing pathogens. However, there's a lot less evidence that directly links if we're increasingly eating foods that from soils with higher soil microbial diversity, if that really supports our gut microbiome. So there's less direct evidence. However, it is an emerging and exciting field of research. And one thing that we can refer to is thinking about the hygiene hypothesis, which does highlight the benefits of rich microbial diversity for humans. And so the hygiene hypothesis suggests that environments with rich microbial diversity, including environments such as farms, protect against allergies and autoimmune disorders. Children with early contact with environments that have more microbial diversity, including farms, have been shown to be less susceptible to developing autoimmune diseases. And then we also know that our ancestors' lifestyles were in close contact with the soil, and there's really been this decrease in exposure to the soil microbiome directly with a shift over time between urban and rural communities, which is linked to increasing negative health implications. And so again, this is an emerging body of evidence, and there's less evidence that really supports the linkages, but it's increasingly recognized. It's increasingly recognized specifically in animal studies because those are easier to carry out compared to human studies. And so there's evidence that show that mice that have been in contact with increased soil microbes have higher gut microbial diversity. And as I mentioned before, higher gut microbial diversity is associated with suppressing disease and supporting the immune system. There's also another study that came out looking at baboons, and soil was found to be the most dominant predictor for shaping the gut microbiota of these baboons, and actually was 15 times stronger than the host genetics of the animals. And the diet of the baboons is in close contact with the soil, and hypothesized that the transmission of soil microbiota for gut colonization happens directly through the diet. And so again, this is another animal study looking at that linkage. And then less evidence in humans, but this is one study. Manual agriculture with close contact to the soil practiced by Amish communities in a microbial-rich rural environment had significant beneficial effects on the immune function compared to rural Hutterites practicing mechanized agriculture. And now I kind of wanted to reflect on, so that was thinking about those direct connections between the soil microbiome and the human gut microbiome. And previously I talked about the linkage through crop quality. And now I wanted to emphasize again the role sort of plants in between the linkage. And so the plant phylosphere is very much recognized as one of the frontiers of research in thinking about how the soil microbiome affects the gut microbiome. And there is little overlap between the soil microbiome and the human gut microbiome because they're very different environments. The human intestine is rich in carbon and energy-rich substances, unlike the soil microbiome. However, the plant rhizosphere as well as the plant phylosphere have more similarities with the human gut microbiome, and thus this is really recognized as this emerging place to carry out research and thinking about linkages between soil health and human health. And so this is sort of where research is now going in thinking about these connections. As I mentioned, both the rhizosphere and the plant phylosphere. And there's some evidence that's showing that not just the roots of the plants, but also the microbial surfaces on fruits and leaves need to be investigated in order to understand the linkages of soil health to human health. Kind of wrapping it up right now, I mentioned the critical role that soils have in supporting food security through nutrition. And increasingly, it's recognized that in addition to organic practices, there's a range of other practices to very much support rich soils, including crop rotations, cover cropping, overall diversified production, integrating livestock into systems, as well as diverse plant species. And so regenerative agriculture, while there's less specific evidence thinking about the linkages to human health, it's increasingly recognized really as a soil-based solution for advancing sustainable food systems. Regenerative agriculture, as we know, is variably defined by different people. However, there are a few key components, and this was a systematic review carried out to look at the different definitions of regenerative agriculture, and the elements that were identified that are in common is that it's an approach of farming that uses soil conservation as the entry point to regenerate and contribute to multiple provisioning, regulating, and supporting services, with the objective that this will enhance not only the environment, but also the social and economic dimensions of sustainable food production. And so I look forward to seeing how regenerative agriculture specifically can contribute to human health going forward. And really enriching the concept of One Health, where all stakeholders in the food system very much have agency in contributing to One Health. So from the farmer perspective, this is managing soils, the world's most biodiverse ecosystem, also contributing to food security for human health, and then consumers having agency in selecting foods grown from healthy soils that ultimately result in price premiums for farmers and supporting farmer livelihoods. And then policymakers also have a great amount of agency in health and really supporting farming practices through incentives that encourage healthy soils, as well as food security for all in vulnerable populations, as well as for future generations. And wanted to leave with this thought. A lot of the elders in the communities I work with in southwestern China speak about, we plant trees for our grandchildren that we may never harvest. And so whatever your quote unquote agroforest is, how can we create nurturing agroforests for future generations through the soil? Thank you. I will now open it up for questions.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed. We've asked for questions in the chat, but I have some things I would love to hear a little bit more from you about. And, you know, in some other sessions, we are hearing a little bit of discomfort with the word regenerative from some. And the reason is due to the potential for greenwashing. I believe personally that the term regenerative really is traditional. It is what the foundation of organic was meant to be. And we have great organizations such as the Real Organic Project, Rodale, Dr. Bronner's, Patagonia, Organic Consumers Association, the bionutrient folks that you are engaged with, and Dan Kittredge, really holding true to those foundational values of what regenerative is. But I was hoping you might speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, when I first started teaching sustainable food systems here at Montana State University, that word, that phrasing of regenerative agriculture didn't appear that often, and more it's increasingly used. And so I did want to give acknowledgement to it. And I would say it very much draws from indigenous management practices that focus on holistic management practices that are really focusing on thinking about those connections of human health and environmental health, but starting from the soil. And so there's, you know, as being a faculty in sustainable food systems, we present many different types of sustainable agricultural practices. And in some ways we can say the word sustainable is also a greenwashed word. And so beyond the terminology, I think it really goes back to the intention. And with regenerative agriculture, it could be considered a greenwashing term that people are using, similar to organic for marketing. But I think going back to what the intention is, which is really starting and thinking about food systems that are supporting environmental health, that are supporting human health, and really starting at the entry point of managing healthy soils. I think that's really what I'm speaking about when I'm using the term regenerative agriculture, because it is very variably defined, and just it's very much of a newer concept that I hear more and more in the classroom. And so I did want to give nod to it. And but I think it really goes back to indigenous farming practices that have occurred for hundreds of years. And when I'm thinking about those diverse agroforests that I work with in southwestern China, the word organic agriculture doesn't fit quite right, and the word sustainable agriculture doesn't fit quite right. And if I'm thinking about the goal of really supporting human and environmental health, starting at the soil, I think the word regenerative agriculture begins to make sense. And so regardless of the terminology, I think it's the intention, the farming approach that you're taking of thinking about how can we manage the soil for food security, for planetary health.
Yes, I totally agree. And I think that for consumers who need to navigate some confusing terminology and certifications even, I think it will be very helpful to have add-on labels to organic, because they know organic, but yet people are starting to understand that, well, not all organic is the same, and not all organic is delivering the nutrient dense products that many people are seeking. And so while I think it is fantastic that organic has grown so much over the last many years, it's really wonderful to be able to have now an add-on label that brings organic practices back to those traditional values of soil health that then translate to higher nutrient density in foods that translate to better human health. Okay, so let's get to some of these questions in here.
One more comment related to that. Absolutely. I think, the best is knowing where your food is coming from, having those direct connections to farmers to really understand how they're managing their agro-ecosystems. And so obviously that's the goal in strengthening consumer to producer relationships. However, since we can't necessarily do that in our current food system for all foods, I would say the labels really provide navigation for consumers, where otherwise we're kind of in a black box. And so there is value for the labeling.
Yes, I agree, because although I produce foods and am not certified and don't use the labels, I have very small scale practices and sell directly to farm or to consumers that can come out and see my farm. And that happens quite a bit around the country, but it can't be for everyone. Okay, so we do have a few questions in here. We've got somebody asking for the best books and resources and public outreach documents that we can refer to learn more and share information.
Wonderful. Would it be possible for me to email them to you, Devana, and then for those to be posted?
Yes, absolutely. That would be great. There's another question about, do you think improving soil health can overcome current crop genetic selection for yield?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's very complex. And I think, when I'm thinking about sustainability and really providing food security outcomes and planetary health outcomes, managing specifically for yield has many shortcomings in really delivering ecosystem services, including micronutrient dense foods. And so I think there's just challenges in general for selection specifically for yield. And in some cases, yield absolutely needs to be accounted for. We need to have adequate amount of calories, but overall in the globe, we are producing adequate amount of calories. It's other issues of distribution. And so the challenge really is more about quality and providing nutrient dense foods. And so I think there's very much a need to shift the paradigm for having crop genetic selection focused primarily on yield to also thinking about other parameters in addition to yield, and also in addition to quality, including being able to be climate resilient to all the different shocks that we're facing. And so really selecting beyond yields for multiple parameters, I think is really necessary. And in that context, if we're only selecting for crop genetic selection for yield, I think there's a huge challenge in moving towards healthy soils that really support food security and nutrient-dense foods and sustainability.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And it's not true cost accounting at all. There's so many externalities that impact our health and our world. And yeah. So India is asking, are there any good forums for peer-to-peer learning around this topic? Before you answer that, I will share that there are some that I know of through a group that is called Institute for Responsible Technology. They are non-GMO, really focused on non-GMO, but really starting to focus on organic, and hopefully they'll pick up on the nutrient density of regenerative. They have groups all around the country that come together and promote, but maybe you can be more specific, Selena, and speak to regenerative.
Yeah, so I think I know less about groups specifically and regenerative, but thinking about the concept of One Health, there's a lot more forums thinking about, I think, planetary health and One Health, and different participants, some are more from the public health sphere and some are more from the agricultural sphere. So those forums I think are exciting because they're having a lot of crosstalk between sectors and between disciplines. And I can't think of the specific forums off the top of my mind that focus on planetary health and One Health, but I would be happy also to share those resources with you that can then be posted. Sorry, I'm not being more helpful in the resource capacity.
No, that's great. That's great. We'll be happy to share it. Thank you so much. We have a thank you for uplifting Indigenous practices. It is so very important that we honor those that came before us and have been practicing these practices for millennia. Okay, so we've got a question from Kabir. Have you thought about other treatments of soil health, such as carbon amendments, diverse crop rotations, minimum tillage, etc., aside from cover crops, to improve the quality of food?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm right now working on a really exciting collaboration, and it's unpublished data, but I can share about the collaboration. We are working on applying probiotics for human health that were intended for human health, and we are applying those as soil amendments to see how that impacts soil microbial diversity, as well as the ability of crops grown in soils with those amendments for improving nutrient quality as well as flavor. And so this is really thinking about increasing soil microbial diversity with probiotics that were initially designed for improving human gut health, and then looking at the linkages. And so that's one really exciting area of research that we're doing as a soil amendment. We've also done a lot of research looking at compost, and specifically compost that's been from food waste on campus here at MSU. And we are starting a new study looking at food waste compost as a soil amendment locally here in Bozeman. So that's another really exciting area of research that we're looking at, of how that compost impacts food quality. We have done some work on very, very minor work on crop rotations and tillage, and those are student projects as well, and also diversification and looking at crop quality. So lots of different ways of thinking about how different soil management practices can impact crop quality.
That's fantastic. And so I think I'll end with this one. Kara Kroger is one of our amazing agricultural specialists based out of the Texas office. And she put a post in here about our Soil for Water work. and we are developing or expanding our Soil for Water network. So please do fill out the application in the link that she provided. And Kara asks about One Health again. So she's wanting to know about the One Health movement. Are there specific things that the CDC is doing to teach people how to apply practices that make significant change?
Yeah, so the CDC on their website has resources that are for different sectors to tangible outcomes or activities that communities can take for engaging in One Health. And so there's sort of community-based initiatives as well as institutional-based initiatives that you can engage in, and those are on the CDC website. And I can also provide links directly to those.
That's fantastic. I have to laugh at the last comment. It was about probiotics to cropland. It reminds me of an African-American gentleman that I work with in Mississippi. And we were out at his site on his farm in the Delta, in the hills, actually, right before the Delta. And he said, see this hillside right here? There was a road and there was a cut hillside with dirt. He said, my elders would walk over and pinch some of this dirt and eat it. They did it often. And he looked at me and said, we didn't buy probiotics. So I think that Tony's last comment about the application rate of yogurt per hectare, so was a good one.
That's a good one.
We thank you so much. Your research you're doing is so important for planetary health, for human health, and for agriculture. Really excited about the work you're doing, and we'll keep following you. Thank you for taking your time with us today.
Thank you so much. And also thank you for your patience. You might have heard my 18-month-old crying in the background. It was her nap time. And apparently she fought her nap time because I heard her crying the entire time. So
I heard, my heart went out to you.
Thank you for your patience.
I felt so bad. You were amazing. Amazing that you were able to get through that, because that's so hard. Thank you for everything. Be well.